So, look, City of Wanneroo, look, we're 25 k's north of Perth. We go from Kundoola in the south up to Two Rocks in the north. We're 686 square kilometres in area, and we've got 32 k's of coastline, so it's absolutely a massive local government area. And we've got three main development areas. We've got the northwest corridor, which has been developing for some time now, which extends from Clarkson to Two Rocks. And you might have seen Clarkson in the news recently with that storm cell that went through. And we had, I think it was about 105 millimetres of rain in about just under an hour. So that's a huge event that recently happened. It was about a 1 in 2,000 ARI event, or so very, very rare, very unlikely. It's the equivalent of a 1% storm event in Darwin. So quite incredible. So Clarkson had quite a bit of rainfall recently. East Wanneroo, we've got the new district structure plan area, which is the equivalent of about 5 Ellenbrooks. So it's a massive area that's about to be developed. And then we've got various infill areas throughout the existing parts of Wanneroo. So we've got all major developers operating within the city. We've got roughly about 40% of the Perth Metro lot creation in City of Wanneroo, which equates to about 48 estate developments, each with 3 to 4 stages of development and various phases. So we've got about 120 active project sites happening at any one time. So as you can imagine, that is a lot of work for the city's land development team to manage. So we've got a team of landscape architects and civil engineers and environmental officers which provide that interface with the development sector, and we supervise all of the new works that are happening, so new roads, new drainage, new public open space. So trying to get those green outcomes and blue outcomes in these new areas is very challenging when you're dealing with that scale. I've also got Metro Nets. We've got 3 new rail stations arriving, and hopefully they'll be opening very soon. And we've got the Mitchell Freeway extension as well. So there's a huge amount of construction activity happening in our city. And we get roughly 2,000 new residential lots on an annual basis being created. So it's a huge amount of development. That sums it up, really. That slide says it all. That's Alaval Estate up near Eglinton. Nestle into nature, it says on the sign. Yeah, says it all. That's one of Pete's developments, name and shame. But look, that's typical of your construction sites. It's all cut and fill, and we are going through a massive de-wilding process up in the City of Wanneroo. It's just phenomenal, the amount of development that's happening and the scale of it. And so we're creating a lot of work for you, Hannah, in the future. So please come up to Wanneroo. So, key local features and conditions. Look, we don't have any natural waterways as such, or arterial drainage like what we have in Shire of Serpentine Jarrahdale. Everything lands and infiltrates at source. It's beautiful sands. So, in the northwest corridor, we've got very low groundwater levels. We've generally got about a 30 to 40 metre groundwater separation. East Wanneroo is a little bit different. We've got high groundwater levels. That's very close to surface. And with, I guess, the development of East Wanneroo, we'll be looking at roughly a 4 metre groundwater rise through that district. So that's going to create a whole lot of interesting challenges as well for the city. And typically our geology is sandy soils, limestone, a bit of bedrock and a bit of karst geology. And as you move across the plain, you get into your grey basandine sands. We've got flow through wetland systems. We've got limited groundwater resources. We've got lots of existing vegetation, much of which is disappearing. And we've also got strong southwesterly winds and easterly winds in summer. So it's quite a harsh kind of environment. And it's mostly greenfield urbanisation. So some of the challenges, well, we don't import fill like Shire of Serpentine Jarrahdale does for their developments. It's all cut and fill, and we're seeing a massive loss of vegetation as a result. So the lovely big sand dunes are removed and then are used to fill the depressions within the landscape. So yeah, it's leading to a massive loss of vegetation. In terms of infiltration, yep, up to 80 metres a day infiltration rates. So water lands and it disappears, unlike Shire of Serpentine Jarrahdale, where it tends to sit on the landscape for a while. And we tend to do retention rather than detention in our stormwater systems. So we have a lot of retention areas in our public open space, and I'll show you some examples shortly. A lot of our cut and fill, which happens, is driven by deep sewerage and also drainage. So those two factors are a major driver in how our landscape is shaped. And we don't have any perched groundwater in our basins, so our swales and retention basins have to try and sustain vegetation over summer without any water sitting in them. So there's no clay soils as such. So they're very harsh, very dry. And we also have very limited groundwater for irrigation. And a lot of that's driven by the Northwest Corridor water supply strategy. Now, DWER limits our ongoing water supply just to turf areas only and for the establishment of garden beds. So once a developer does their subdivision, creates streetscape and garden bed assets over that 2-year establishment period, when it's handed over to the city, that irrigation gets switched off permanently. So it makes trying to create a green environment, green asset, very challenging for the city. And we've also got restrictions on our groundwater licences as well. So we've got 6,750 kilolitres a hectare compared to the 7,500 kilolitres a hectare, which is seen across the rest of Perth. So it is very challenging. And that restricted water supply really drives our landscape design and outcomes. And we are really pushing to retain native remnant vegetation where we can. And that's very hard in a cut and fill kind of development environment. And it really does encourage water sensitive urban design. We want to passively irrigate our streetscapes and our street trees. So we have lots of rain gardens and swales and tree pits. And we have to carefully consider drainage basin design in the context of the fact that we have free draining soils. So we've got those lovely coastal sands, water lands on it, it disappears. We have an infiltration rate of 80, sometimes up to 100 metres a day. And we've got vegetation that has to survive over that summer period with no rainfall. And so the last 6-7 months has been very challenging up in the City of Wanneroo. So a quick transit across the city. So going from the beach, we've got our lovely Quindle up soils and vegetation. You've got your Cottesloe soils and veg with your Tamala limestone underneath. Actually, and that's some of the most biodiverse areas in the North Metro. The vegetation's amazing and the biodiversity is incredible through there. But you've got very shallow limestone, and this vegetation's designed or evolved to actually survive on there. So it's quite beautiful. You've got your Karrakatta soils, your yellow sands and your Jarrah Marri woodlands. And you get into your Bassendean soils and veg as you move across the coastal plain into your lovely Bankshire woodlands. So quick case study. Alkimos Vista Estate up in Alkimos, stage 1. We actually had a new residential development. I think it was started back in 2019, 2020 when this went in. Roughly 425 residential lots, and we have a POS that covers about 2.26 hectares, and it's surrounded by residential development. It's on the Quindle up soil type, and we've got infiltration rates of about 31 metres a day. Depth of groundwater is about 14 to 34 metres, and we've got Bankshire woodland and coastal heath. So it's some of the most biodiverse, unique vegetation you will see anywhere on the planet. And in terms of the drainage design, look, we adopted water sensitive urban design across that estate. We've got our flood storage area, we've got our bioretention areas, there's a couple of those in dark blue, and then we've got all our other uses. So we've got a multiple use kind of park, very similar to the multi-use corridors that you'll get in Shire, Serpentine, Jarrahdale. We've got multi-function, and in terms of the design, our bioretention areas, we've designed them with an infiltration rate of 4 to 9 metres a day, and our flood storage areas of roughly 10 metres a day. That's just to factor in changes in infiltration rate over time. But with cut and fill, it's made it very difficult to actually retain vegetation in this public open space, even though it's quite large. So here's the site, pre-development. You can see the estate cadastral boundaries up there. There's the Picasso Park area here. Beautiful Bankshire woodland across that site. and it all disappears. So this is typical right across the northwest corridor in City of Wanneroo. My team, my team fight hard to retain what they can in these locations. So we've managed to retain a little bit of Banksia woodland in here and a little bit over here. It's very difficult to do, particularly when you're trying to do flood storage and drainage, and you've got a whole lot of other competing values and factors. But my landscape architects fought hard to retain this, and we had to do it through a variation to design criteria. So as an engineer, in terms of flood storage, we like to limit the flood storage depth to about 1.2 metres for that 1 in 100, 1% annual exceedance probability event. So in terms of our bioretention area, that floods to a height of about 0.5 metres, then overtops and then floods out the broader POS in a larger event. This Banksia woodland sits roughly 1.7 metres below the top water level of that flood event. It's rather deep. Now, if we were to apply the 1.2 metre design criteria in that location, that would have been filled in, so we would have lost all that lovely Banksia woodland. So we had to go through a process of looking at our values. What do we value? Flood depth criteria, or do we value Banksia woodland, which is critically endangered? It's like, well, let's try and retain Banksia woodland. So we went through that process and we managed to get a really good outcome in terms of retaining some Banksia woodland and integrating it into the broader multiple uses within that park. And that's it today. So, as I mentioned before, yeah, be willing to vary some of your design criteria to get better outcomes. Okay. In terms of risk, okay, 1.7 metres depth, okay, in that 1% event, okay, it's a little bit deeper. Okay, what are the risks around that? Well, you can try and mitigate that by putting in ingress and egress so people can walk in, walk out quite easily. Put in some flood depth gauges and some warning signs. And that way we can retain that beautiful Banksia woodland and also, I guess, achieve the required safety requirements through there. And that's just an example of what went in, depth gauges and beautiful Banksia woodland, so we can achieve some outcomes in terms of veg retention. Some of the issues, the vegetation guidelines for stormwater biofilters in southwest WA was adopted for this site. Unfortunately, landscape architects don't necessarily know plant species very well, and so a lot of wetland plants went into the biofilter in that park. You've got carex, you've got juncus, lepidosperma, mewardina, all require permanent moisture and or even permanent water, standing water, to be able to survive. And what we're finding is we really need to put dryland species into our bioretention areas so they survive over that summer period, particularly if the irrigation is going off once it's handed over to the city. And we're finding we're getting a lot of this in our parks, basically sand pits, looks like a bit of a moonscape. The only way to get around that is to put in suitable plant species. So we don't just tick boxes. I think local government officers like to stand back and look at the bigger picture. So a design prepared by a developer's consultant may tick the boxes in terms of the different requirements, but is it the best design approach? And that's something which you need to keep in the back of your mind when you're doing assessments. And be willing to vary design criteria by using a risk-based approach. So even if you do vary criteria like flood depth, okay, you can mitigate that by doing other things. And can better design outcomes be achieved through trade-offs and variations to design criteria or guidelines? So we managed to retain some Banksia woodland by having a trade-off with flood depth. So that was quite an interesting process to go through. And just a thing on plant selection, it's critical for your bioretention areas. If you want those bioretention areas to function, make sure you put the right species in and choose plants that are suited to the site conditions. So that's just a bit of a message for the landscape architects in the room. All right. Good.